So the Christian movement begged for a historian. And that begs a question. What is history? Well, a common kind of naive notion is history is what really happened. History is the past. Not so fast. It's not that simple. History is a memory of the past, and memory is complicated. It suffers from distance, from subjectivity, from our points of view and their limits, from selectivity, from what we choose to remember or convey and what we don't, from bias, from the agendas of the witnesses and the agendas of the reporters. Politics complicate how we remember the past. Culture complicates it. Power complicates it. Agendas along those lines and many others complicate, inform, and perhaps distort the historical process. Christopher Nolan, who made the film Memento, which is a fascinating approach to a narrative, said, "Narrative is the controlled release of information." Well, history is a kind of narrative, which means history is a kind of releasing of a kind of information. So I want to give you a more nuanced definition of history. History is the purposeful narration of past events. So far, I've been describing history in general. Well, what about Christian history? What about church history? If history is the purposeful narrative of past events, then church history, Christian history, is the Christian community's faithful remembrance of its past, and particularly the crucial events of its past. I have a metaphor for you from the world of music. Cover songs. A cover song is a purposeful rehearsing of a song that people already know. It's a narration of past events. And what it does with that past event could be anything from sheer imitation, trying to reproduce the original song as closely as you can. You get a lot of bands that tour just trying to remind fans of their original bands that are long gone. Or a cover song can be creatively faithful to the original, but draw out both dynamics in the original that you hadn't heard before, or introduce some of the dynamics of the artist. Iz's cover of Somewhere Over the Rainbow is, I think, a creatively faithful cover song, giving us back a past but with a new angle. Eva Cassidy's cover of Somewhere Over the Rainbow became the subject of a whole chapel talk 20 years ago at my school, because she seemed to identify something in the song that wasn't in the original Wizard of Oz version, a note of longing, a note of eschatological hope. That's what the chapel speaker latched onto and wanted us to see. So a cover song can be faithful to its past, even while it's creative with its past. Classical music is massively dedicated to the creatively faithful, but especially faithful and accurate covering of the classics. On the other hand, a cover song can be unfaithful or even subversive to what it's covering. I'm going to include links to a couple of subversive cover songs. One mocks its original. The other puts it in an entirely different light. My students, last time I played this in New Testament, hated this song. It showed up in the course evaluations. Why did you play this song? So, hey, if you don't want to click on the link, don't click on the link. I do want to make this vivid to you. The way we remember the past isn't neutral. And it's not simply recitation. It's not simply repetition. It's always a reappropriation of what came before. And a cover song has to cover some pre-existing song. It can't be entirely original. Cover songs are historical in the sense that they're about a real past. You can't just make up history. Fantasy isn't history. History is the remembering, the purposeful narration of past events. History reflects on genuine past events and considers their significance. This gives rise to a tradition that's strong in biblical scholarship called historical criticism. Historical critics look critically at the practice of historiography. That doesn't mean that they're negative. It just means that they're appraising what historians are doing. They ask questions like, why is the information being released this way? Who's doing the narrating? Where is the historian located? Maybe which social community? What is that narrator's purpose? And since history is rhetorical, since this presentation is being shaped to be received in a certain way by the audience, a historical critic is also going to ask, who are the audiences of this history? Where are they located? What might their agendas be? And a major preoccupation of historical critics for the last couple centuries has been, how responsible is our historian? How accurate is this narrative to the past that it claims to represent to us? In the Acts of the Apostles, we are reading nearly 2,000-year-old history coming from a very different cultural place, with different standards for what counts as history and what counts as accurate history. So when we judge Luke the historian, of course we can't help but judge him from some way from our own perspective. But we really have to keep in mind, he's not trying to be a 21st century historian. Luke is trying to be a 1st century historian. So we need to look around his social world for signs of what counted as good 1st century history. If we look at the form of the book of Acts, as well as the Gospel of Luke, we see signs everywhere that Luke is putting himself in the tradition of ancient Greco-Roman historiography, and he's doing it well. So we can look to other Greco-Roman historians, especially when they tell us about their methods, for signs of what to expect from Luke and the standards to hold Luke accountable to. An ancient historian, Lucian of Samosata, said, "The sole task of the historian is to tell it just as it happened." Well, that sounds a lot like history today. The historian Polybius writes, "A historical author should simply record what really happened and what really was said." So it sounds like history hasn't really changed. An emphasis on accuracy that we have today isn't new. A high regard for accuracy goes all the way back to the father of history, Thucydides, centuries before Luke. And that might tempt us to judge Luke the historian by our standards, since we hear the same values communicated back then. Well, not so fast. What if standards of accuracy aren't the same today as they were back then? That same Lucian, in his book How to Write History, says this, and it might be a little rattling. If someone has to be brought in to give a speech, above all, let his language suit his person and his subject. Has to be brought in to give a speech? It sounds more like docudrama than straight history here. It is then, however, he says, that you can exercise your rhetoric and show your eloquence. The historian can make the character sound as great as the historian is able. The historian engages not just in reporting, but in what today we call post-production, making the scene as tight as it can be and displaying the historian's talent for eloquence. There are also signs that Greco-Roman historians, despite their penchant for accuracy, don't get everything right, might not have the access to get everything right. There is one famous instance in Acts chapter 5, where Luke seems to be misdating an event. He has Gamaliel speaking before the assembly of Jewish leaders and talking about Theudas' rebellion. Well, Theudas' rebellion happened between 46 and 48 AD, but the scene in Acts chapter 5 has to happen before AD 37. So that seems to be a misdated event. What do we do with that? If we saw something like that in the 21st century history, that would become a big problem for the historian. We would say, check your sources. You haven't done your job. You've been sloppy. Maybe you haven't even been honest. Well, the Greco-Roman world doesn't seem to have quite the same exacting standards, although it does have the same aspirations. Nevertheless, this is in a speech that Gamaliel is giving before the assembly. Is Luke doing what Lucian says you can do, lending his own rhetorical eloquence and his own power to help Gamaliel make his point? It is a powerful point. If God is behind these Christians, then we can't stop them. And if God isn't, then they're going to fail the way Theudas' rebellion failed, the way every false rebellion eventually peters out and collapses. So, historical criticism is an important practice. On the one hand, we want to gauge how much accuracy we should be expecting. We want to gauge how trustworthy the history is. And we want to know what should we do when we're surprised by what we find. A big impulse in modern historical criticism is to find the events behind the text. The problem there is, of course, what do we do when we can't find it? What do we do when our whole record of the past is the history we're reading? Let me give you some examples of that from my own life. My mother is 90 years old as I deliver this lecture, and we lost my dad about 35 years ago. So she is the sole source. She was an only child. Her parents are gone. She's really the only one with the living memories of before we were born. So she talks about dating my dad. She talks about the life that kind of led to us kids. I don't have any access, any independent access back to the events that she's talking about. In fact, I don't know that we ever would have, because in a lot of those events, she and he were the only two with the memory of them. Well, am I stuck? Do I just have to trust my mom? I do trust my mom, but I don't trust her with every memory, especially when I remember some of the things she talks about differently when she's talking about things that happened within my lifetime. Now, here's another story of a narrator of past events. I once had a conversation with a homeless person some years ago, who in the course of that conversation told me that he had written Van Halen's song Jump, and that they had basically stolen the intellectual property and managed to collect all of the royalties, cheating him out of his share. Now, I don't have any access to that information any more than I do to my mom and dad's dating life. I can't verify what happened on my mom and dad's first date. I can't verify whether that fellow actually wrote the song Jump. I know I can't trust any old person's testimony for something like that. And as I've told you, even though I trust my mom more than a stranger, I don't trust her to be an infallible memory of her own past, especially as the years go by. So what do I do? Well, I could ascertain the character of each storyteller and the general accuracy of each storyteller if I get to know that homeless person better. If we hang out for weeks or months, then I might have a better basis for whether I can trust those kinds of testimonies for him. In my mom's case, I can check with family relatives. I can check with my big sister and big brother and see if her memory of things that happened in their lifetimes, but not mine, check out. And that raises my confidence level. I can also ascertain her motives. Does she have a reason to remember it differently or to represent it differently to me? All of this suggests an alternative approach to the modern preoccupation with finding out the events behind the text and determining whether they're true or not. And it's this: if the narrator proves trustworthy, trust him or her. If not, don't. A more realistic task than uncovering a history that's impossible to recover, or just doubting it because we can't confirm it. And also a more faithful task, a task that's truer to the character of this community that is so serious about holding on to the memories of Israel, Jesus, and the apostles, is to trust trustworthy narrators. And of course that means determining whether they are trustworthy. Let's look back at that tradition of Greco-Roman historiography for what kinds of things we should be expecting. Here's a quote from Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War. With reference to the speeches in this history, some were delivered before the war began, others while it was going on. It was hard to record the exact words spoken, both in cases where I was myself present and where I used the reports of others. But I have used language in accordance with what I thought the speakers in each case would have used, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what was actually spoken. How reassuring do you find that guidance? On the one hand, Thucydides is trying, he's doing his best. On the other hand, where there are gaps, he's filling them as faithfully as he can, in ways that modern historians are not allowed to do. The standards of Greco-Roman history seem reliable, but annoyingly imprecise by our standards. And it truly does annoy those of us in the modern age who want a 21st century historian who footnotes sources, who consults libraries, who sticks to what we know, who uses quotation marks. They didn't have quotation marks in Luke's day any more than they did in Thucydides' day. So it can be hard for us to determine whether a quote is direct or indirect, or, as you've seen, a creative appropriation of a tradition, or, as we've seen, the historian doing his or her best to convey the general sense of what was said in a way, as Lucian said, that helps convey the eloquence of the historian and of the figure if that figure needs to be brought in to make a speech. Annoying. Here are some ways that we can do more than just cross our fingers or assume that because it's in the Bible it has to be accurate. Because Acts is a sequel, because it's volume 2 of Luke Acts, we can look at how Luke uses Jesus' traditions and compare it to the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, and gauge how Luke is covering the song, so to speak. When we see how Luke likely shapes Jesus' traditions, then that helps give us a sense of how he is likely shaping the even more recent traditions of the apostles in the book of Acts. And he does seem to be shaping them. For instance, Peter and Paul sound a lot alike when they speak in the book of Acts. It seems like we're hearing some of Luke, as well as some of Peter and some of Paul. We can also confirm how faithful Luke seems to be to Paul by comparing Luke's version of Paul to Paul's own version of Paul in his letters. Finally, we can look at signs of whether Luke is being honest and telling the whole story, or just telling it the way he wants us to hear it. We can look at Luke's willingness to do more than just public relations when he's writing his history. And when we do, we find some real candor. We find some real willingness to look under the rock and see what Christians aren't really happy to see. We see Peter's failings as a disciple in Luke's gospel. We see the betrayal of Judas Iscariot, which is horribly inconvenient for a movement. We see Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. So we see a corrupt couple of Christians. We see ethnic friction between the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebraic Jews in Acts chapter 6. We see personal and professional friction between Paul and Barnabas and Mark. We see Luke ready to tell us inconvenient things, ready to tell us things we don't want to hear if we're Christians. And those are signs that Luke is an honest historian.